Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So, Adam, do you remember a few weeks ago when we talked about the LastPass breach and kind of the update on everything that happened and how it happened?
I do indeed remember that.
One of the remediation steps that the LastPass team took was to help secure the individuals that were involved in the breach, their home networks. And the NSA recently published a information sheet on best practices for securing your home network. And it is really good. Now, for most cybersecurity practitioners, you probably will look at this and hopefully say to yourself that I'm doing most of these things. There's even a few tidbits that are good for folks that are seasoned practitioners. But for most people who are not in cybersecurity, this is a really, really good document that you can give to someone. And if you remember, the folks that were compromised in the LastPass, they were like DevOps people, right? They were like developers. And I think that most like IT people, while they may have security kind of somewhere on their radar, they probably don't go through and just, do all the security things, the tinfoil hat things that like I do at my home. And I'm probably even more crazy than you are, Adam. But that's just the way a lot of the security practitioners think. Is like, okay, I'm going to do as much as possible. So I wanted to talk through this. Of course, the link will be in the show notes for the actual document. But again, a lot of really good tidbits in here. So the very first page is an executive summary, and there's a few things. They start off with some basic things along with a graphic that kind of gives you the highlights of the whole document. So if you needed to, you could just like hand out or maybe print off the executive summary and hang it somewhere in your organization on a bulletin board or whatever. But it's just basic things like upgrade and update all of your equipment, software regularly, including your routing devices, exercise secure habits by backing up your data, disconnecting devices when they aren't connected, limiting administration to internal network only. And so, those are like some basic things. And then it goes into some more detailed recommendations. And that's where I just wanted to talk about each one of these just briefly here. So they talk about device security and making sure that all of your operating systems, so all the things, desktops, laptops, smart devices, including IoT, are updated at all times. Now, for me, I have many laptops that I just have automatic updates. That's pretty standard these days. A lot of my IoT devices are updated automatically as well, usually by default. But there are a few things like, for example, in the LastPass incident, I have a Plex server, and that is not updated automatically. So I have to go in and update that. And then the machines that they run on, for example, I host it on something called Unraid, which is very similar to like, say, VMware Horizons at an enterprise level, right? It's just a hypervisor that is hosting it. That also needs to be manually updated as well. So there's updates that come out for that. And, my access points, some of them aren't automatically upgraded. I choose that. You can have them automatically upgrade, but because of some issues I've had, I manually update them. So, you got to make sure everything is updated. And specifically, they called out the router in here, which a lot of people get a router from their ISP. You definitely get a modem, but some people get a router too. Like with AT&T, I know that it was a combination and it has an access point and everything. The NSA actually recommended that you use your own router as a secondary device that's connected to your ISP's primary device. And they want you to have, at a minimum, 3 different networks: a primary network, a guest network, and then an IoT one for segmentation. And you should keep them patched, and then if they reach end of life, you should replace them. As far as the Wi-Fi goes, WPA3 is the newest standard, and that's been out for a few years, and now there's devices that can connect to WPA3. But if you have devices that require WPA2 still, you can use the WPA2/3, which allows the newer devices to connect to WPA3 and the older ones to connect to WPA2. And they recommend having a passphrase of at least 20 characters. So I read that and I thought, oh, I don't have a passphrase of 20 characters. So, again, like these are tidbits. This is what the NSA is recommending for the best practices here. Changing your SSID to something unique, and then don't hide it, because that doesn't really provide any additional security. The changing the SSID is, again, something that is recommended because if you, like for me, I drive by my neighborhood and my phone will actually automatically connect it or try to connect to somebody's network when I drive by it, because I have a network that's saved in my phone or something that is just the standard name that I connected to at one point, and the person's house, they never changed that default SSID. So, changing that is a good recommendation. And then finally, on the network side, verifying that your router uses NAT. This is pretty standard. Most modern routers have a NAT firewall that's built in. So that just means that you can't get access to your internal network from the external internet.
There's a lot here. And I think, especially for like normals, muggles, whatever you want to call them, they're definitely not doing a lot of this as far as the segmentation, the 20 character passphrases. I think some of the easier wins here for, again, muggles would be things like using a different router than the one that comes from your ISP. And this is not just a security benefit. This is a performance benefit, by the way, because they always give you garbage. I've seen a trend lately where they're starting to give people Eero devices, which is a trend I'm for and think is a great change from kind of the really crappy routers they used to give out. But, the problem with that is even with those, like, it requires a little bit of kind of knowledge into how to do it, depending on your ISP. Like, for example, for me, my previous ISP was a local fiber provider called Metronet, and they gave you what's called an ONT, which is an optical network terminal, and literally fiber goes in one end and Ethernet comes out the other, and then you plug your Ethernet into whatever and it's fine. So you can literally just plug a router in out of the box and it works. It's great. I have CenturyLink fiber now, and they require like specific VLAN settings to be turned on for it to work. Now, my router actually had that out of the box. I just had to pick it from a dropdown and say I have CenturyLink as my ISP, and then it did all the VLAN tagging automatically. But still, like, that's way past the range of skill of most muggles. So I do think this is any and all of these are kind of more advanced moves to harden your environment. But maybe the one everyone can do is have a 20 character passphrase as an example. So you kind of pick and choose which ones you can get to. Obviously more is better. But I would say I recognize for sure that some of these are harder to do than others. Even a 20 character passphrase is hard, because then I think of like trying to type that on, some weird like IoT device or something where it makes you put it in on like a tiny screen and you have to scroll through the characters one at a time. Like, it might take you a half hour to connect. Now, admittedly, you only have to do it once, but still, like, you'd say, gosh, do I really need it to be that long? This is a pain. So,
like your Nest thermostat.
There you go.
You got scroll through that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, turn the ring.
So the next one, and I like how you're kind of scoping it in the terms of muggles as you're putting it, because this next one I think is also tough, like using security software. Now, for the most part, on Windows, most people can just use the built-in Windows Defender AV agent. You don't need to like buy anything else. Mm-hmm. On Mac, I don't run anything that is like a outside of, since mine is actually connected to the Microsoft device management, it downloads the Defender for Endpoint agent on there. But if it wasn't managed, I wouldn't have any other software, security software on there. And I think there is kind of this fallacy that Macs are safer because there isn't, they can't be infected, which is not true. Like there is malware and there is certainly ransomware for Macs, but it's just less prevalent. And because it's Linux, everything has to run elevated. So you will always get prompted to put in your password, which, like, I would say most people, if they clicked on something and then they're like, yeah, I meant to run this, they'll just put in their password. But Mac does build in a lot of things like verified publisher. You have to actually go to the security settings and run anyways, right? Like they tell you this is risky behavior. So there is some stuff that's default in there. The thing that I think is difficult that the NSA is recommending is full disk encryption. Now, BitLocker is not turned on by default. FileVault is not turned on by default. And I think those things are a little bit more difficult because if you do forget your password or something like that, right, now you have to unlock it and there could be data loss. And that could be a little challenging for non-technical folks.
FileVault in particular is still for all of Apple's achievements in like usability. There are a lot of Windows PCs that ship with Windows Pro that do ship now with BitLocker on by default. If you buy a Surface device that ships with Windows Pro, which nowadays you have to buy like the 4 business one, but back in the day they used to all ship with Pro, and BitLocker is actually enabled by default on most of those. And overall, it's a pretty seamless experience. FileVault has still kind of got some rough edges in my experience. Now, FileVault is very performant because even going all the way back to some of the later Intel-based Macs, including the one I'm recording this on right now, they used to ship with that security coprocessor. I believe it was called the T2. And that did all of the disk encryption on that coprocessor, so the CPU didn't get bogged down at all. So it was very seamless to enable full disk encryption. And I have FileVault turned on, again, on the Mac I'm recording on right now, but it's still one of those things that, again, like it's kind of hard to recommend. Like, go call my mom and tell her, hey, mom, you should turn on FileVault on your Mac. Like, I'm sure it's even better on Apple Silicon Macs, but still, it's just one of those that I think has some rough edges. I actually think the implementation of BitLocker in some cases is a little bit better. But either way, there are still rough edges for everyone. So I think a lot of this guidance, the more we kind of talk through it, this isn't really for muggles. This is for like, I'm a security practitioner. I really want to make sure I harden my home network as much as possible. Because I think you could do a separate list of like quick and accessible wins that they could achieve without having to do a whole lot of work. This seems more for like, I'm technical. I want to know I have the best possible security without being overboard. What can I do? That feels like more of the sweet spot of where this is at, which is not to be dismissive of it. This is great. And I think there's things here where it's like, I've been meaning to do that. I should really go ahead and start doing that work. I've seen several items in here, like you predicted, Andy, that I would take away and say, okay, you know what? It's time. I have the wherewithal. I have the capability. I should go ahead and do that because it's going to harden my environment.
Yes. The next one is protecting your passwords, which of course, we all do for the most part in a password manager. It does. NSA is recommending strong, unique passwords per account. They shouldn't be stored in plain text anywhere. Use a password manager. Nothing earth-shattering here. However, I have a great tip that I picked up from someone named Rachel Tobach. And if you're familiar with the InfoSec Twitter community, she is very prevalent there. She is a well-known social media hacker. She is very, very good. She famously was able to hack a reporter with his consent in mere minutes to get his email, Amazon account, and all of that. Just by putting a crying baby on the phone and essentially pretending to be a wife and a newborn mother and trying to get her husband's password. And so she's very good at that. One of her tips is, we talk about the LastPass breach and kind of losing confidence in password managers. And a lot of people are like, okay, well, I'm going to take it out of LastPass, put in something else. But what if that also gets compromised? So if you're really tinfoil hat kind of person, you really want to secure the passwords. And maybe this isn't something you do for like all of your passwords, but maybe just like your banking and your email, like the most, the crown jewels. She has a tip of salting your own passwords. Now, it's not necessarily salting it like in the real sense of salting it, but kind of like a salt light, And what she says is store your password, a randomized password, in your password vault. But then have a letter, symbol, multiple letters, a passphrase, whatever you want that only you know. And then when you have that password filled in from the vault, you type that extra passphrase, character, whatever it is, at the end, at the beginning, in the middle, wherever you want. And that essentially is your own quote unquote salt to a password that is stored there. And that way, even if your vault gets breached, they don't actually have your password because it includes this extra character or phrase or whatever. So I thought that was actually really interesting. I'm going to actually probably do that for some of my really valuable accounts. Adam and I were talking before the show, and it's like, well, for my email, for my banking, yes. For my Pizza Hut account, probably don't need the extra salt, right?
Especially on Pizza Hut, it's salty enough. I love this tip. This is great, and it's really easy to implement. It doesn't have to be complicated. Andy, as we talked about on the pre-show, literally could be one character, and that could be enough. If you've got a 32 character randomly generated password, if you just consistently knew in your mind, like, I'm going to add this character to the front of all of them, or the end of all of them, or 3 character positions in, that's going to be enough to deter all but the most determined adversary. It's going to really, really help. So, a pretty straightforward tip. The one thing I think that will prevent this from being super widely adopted is that the current behavior of password managers is that they submit. They fill in all the fields and they do the submission. They would need to actually hold back and not submit, but just fill. And then I can make the modification before submitting. So I'm sure you will see that come where you can toggle a setting like in 1Password to say, okay, fill, but don't submit. And then this will be easy to do. So love it. What a simple tip that's super powerful.
Safeguarding against eavesdropping. The NSA warns that all of your home assistant devices like Alexa or your HomePod, Google Assistants, whatever, they're always listening. And when you're not actively engaging the device, you should make sure that you are not talking about any sensitive information, and even, perhaps turning off the microphone if that's possible when not in use. So kind of confirmed, I think most people assume that they're listening all the time, but NSA just kind of outright tells you that they are, and don't talk about anything sensitive here.
They would know. They have law enforcement in particular. I know NSA is not law enforcement, but they're adjacent to it, have in fact subpoenaed the Amazons of the world for people's Amazon Echo recordings to see if there's anything that could be gleaned from them. So this is absolutely something that has been used against people in the past, and could be used by, and not saying law enforcement or adversarial, but adversaries as well potentially could intercept those, could get access to them if one of these providers was ever compromised, et cetera, et cetera. So you should be really diligent about muting them when they're not in use. Maybe disabling the wake word behavior entirely, requiring the physical tap to turn them on, whatever. Again, depending on your level of tinfoil hatism, you probably just don't allow them in your house if you're really crazy, but definitely limit, kind of your exposure to them. And for the most part, I will say that these devices, like we can monitor their traffic. We know that they essentially do not transmit anything unless they hear their wake word, and then they transmit that to the home office essentially for processing. However, that doesn't mean you will never inadvertently, or they would inadvertently or incorrectly hear the wake word and then upload a whole bunch of content. And that's actually what has happened in the past is nobody intentionally said like the Amazon gal's name, but the device thought they did and then started recording a whole bunch of conversations. So you can just never be too sure. They're not actually continuously uploading, just to be clear. They don't do that, and we know that. We validated that behavior. But they can inadvertently do it, and that's risk enough. So again, take proper precautions with that. I know Microsoft, we have to do security training every year, and they say in your home office, you should not have one of those in the office with you. It's actually, I don't know if it's company policy, but it's certainly company guidance that when you're discussing, sensitive matters, company matters, you don't want one of those smart assistants in the room.
Backing up data on external drives and disconnecting them when not in use. Avoid public charging stations. I know I do this when I'm traveling. I don't plug into any of those USBs. I usually use a power brick instead. There's definitely risk involved depending on what level of comfort you have. So I always just use a power brick. Reboot regularly to apply updates. There's actually several references to rebooting in the document. I actually am fairly consistent in shutting down everything at the end of the night and starting up fresh every morning. I know most people don't do that, but I mainly do it just because it's peace of mind. Like I have, mentally, I'm like, I'm done with the day. I'm shutting it down. But in here, they talk about rebooting to apply updates. That's for sure. You should do that. And then turning off devices or disconnecting them from the internet if they aren't used for an extended period of time, like going on vacation. I know that I unplug my NAS devices when I go on vacation. That's mostly for power consumption, but also just I don't really have a reason to keep them on. So if there's a risk, it won't be when I'm not home. And then limiting administration to the internal network. This is mostly true, but some of the newer routers, they do have remote administration options, and then you can like look at them from your phone or an app or something like that. For the most part, that does open up quite a bit of risk. So most of the time, there's no reason why you need to administer, unless you have like a vacation home or something like that, or for me, actually, I administer the network for my parents' home. So I have a unified system, which is, enterprise, quote unquote, level. And it's designed to do that for small offices. But if it's like some TP-Link router that you have enabled, I would probably turn that off. And then there's another feature called Universal Plug and Play. Most security professionals know that you should disable this by default as well. And they specifically call out device reboots in a separate section where this is fairly known to the security community, but a lot of people don't know this, that there's sometimes non-persistent malicious code that is running. So someone gets into your environment and then they have some sort of code and it's non-persistent, which means that as soon as you reboot, that malicious code is gone. So the NSA is recommending, not only reboots for your devices to apply updates, but also reboot just as a defense, because it could wipe out any type of malicious implants that are there.
I love this one in particular. I know not a lot of devices, at least that I have, allow me to schedule reboots, but the one that does is my router. And so I have mine set to reboot daily at like 3 a.m. every day. Also just because, and any of us who have the scar tissue going back to like the old crappy routers that used to run out of memory and get wonky, and you'd call the cable company. And of course, the first thing is, did you reboot your modem? Did you reboot your router? Like, I just feel better if it reboots daily. So I didn't realize that had a security benefit too. I mean, I do now in hindsight because I understand the concept of non-persistence. However, it's just, it's interesting that that's a simple thing again that can have performance benefits as well as security benefits. So that's a pretty easy one to do. Anything that lets you schedule a reboot, hell yeah, schedule those reboots for the middle of the night when you're not using them and just get that fresh start for performance reasons and security reasons. Easy to do.
Upgrade to a modern browser, keep it up to date. I know a lot of people, this is like a huge pet peeve of mine, when someone does a presentation and they show their browser and it has that like little red arrow that says update. Like I get it, you know, you have all these tabs open and you don't want to like restart your browser. A lot of modern browsers, when they update, they will cache that information so that you will actually get those tabs back. If you're using Edge, there's like ways to like add them to a collection. I do that all the time where it kind of just saves it and you can open them all up again. But yeah, definitely keep your browser up to date. Authentication safeguards. I thought this was super interesting too. Disable features that allow websites or programs to remember your passwords. Use a password manager instead. That's the NSA recommendation here. I mean, probably a good one. I would say most browsers, modern browsers like Chrome and Edge, Firefox, do a really good job of securing the passwords that they're storing in there, but probably better to centralize them through a password manager because that requires authentication versus like the browser where if you leave it up, anyone can just kind of browse to things and then autofill, right? Online sites that use password recovery or challenge questions, preventing an attacker from leveraging personal information to answer those. Consider using a false answer to a fact-based questions, assuming the response is unique and memorable. I've been doing this for years, just using the notes section of a website. If they have recovery information or they require me to put in some additional thing like my child's first name or the high school that I went to, I just put gibberish. Either like if it's a drop down and they need me to select it, I select the wrong answer and I record it in the notes, or I use the password manager and generate a random string of letters and I fill that in. Like, what's the first name to your child? It's just a random 20 character string of just uppercase and lowercase characters. And then I just record that in the notes. So, yeah. And the NSA recommends that here. And then of course use MFA.
The challenge questions that's great advice. And again, like if I would offer my own advice, to muggles, it might be, if you're gonna pick one of those, at least pick one that's like not in public records, like not your mother's maiden name, not where you went to school, not your first job, like anything that's easily verifiable with public information. Don't do. There's usually at least security questions that are obscure enough that like it's not documented everywhere, or to even triangulate the documentation of it would be just impossible to achieve. Like the name of my first boss, that would require you to know like where my first job was and who all worked there at the same time and who I reported to. Now, if you can go back and figure that out for a place 23 years ago, then you know what? Just have my account, man. Like you've done enough work, but at least like don't pick anything that's simple to look up in public records or anything like that. If at least make it easier. But really the guidance you're talking about, Andy, is even better, which is they're inherently flawed. Just for the same reason passwords are inherently flawed, where it's something that if somebody else has access to it, then they have access to the account. So try to avoid or minimize your use of them as much as possible. And then going back to the other thing on built-in password management in browsers, I think to your point, the concern isn't that Microsoft or Google are bad stewards of that data. I'm sure it's very safe within their broader environments. I think the problems are like you talked about, that there isn't any sort of time-based like lockout where if somebody locks up to the machine, now they have access to every password I have saved. And I think the other part too is, and 1Password really talked about this, how 1Password not only requires you to know like username, your one password, but then there's that randomly generated secret key that you have to have in order to gain access to that account. And so that is different than like for somebody to sign into like an Edge browser as me, it could just be as simple as they do like push notification spamming and I accidentally accept one. And now they're in and now they've access to all my passwords. Like for them to get into my one password would be significantly harder without my permission than to get into my Google account would be a similar thing where, again, I hope it's hard, but still it's not as difficult as a standalone password manager. So I think, your passwords are safe in terms of like data at rest, data in transit. I think the concern is if your workstation is compromised, they're tremendously easier to access on there.
They talk about public hotspots. And of course, we know this. Don't use public Wi-Fi when possible. Use like a VPN or your personal hotspot instead. And then exercise physical security in public spaces. Don't leave your devices unattended. Like when I am traveling or I'm in a coffee shop or whatever, if I have to like leave my stuff or go to the bathroom, I will actually shut everything down and take it with me. Mm-hmm. I have seen though where people are like talking to the person next to them like, hey, can you watch my stuff? I'm sure people are for the most part pretty good about that sort of thing, but man, I would never ask someone to watch my stuff. I would just physically pack everything up if I had to go to the bathroom and just come back and put everything back up,
I still hit Windows key L when I work from home. I get up from my desk to like go use the restroom in my own house. I will still Windows key L lock my screen before I walk away. Like I am physically incapable of not doing that. I have to lock it anytime I go anywhere. And I'm the same way. Like trust no one. I'm hauling all that stuff with me if I have to use something and I'm by myself. And what's interesting too, again, I kind of keep making this point, which is interesting with all these security related guidance. Performance comes up yet again. With modern 5G networks, they are so fast compared to almost any public Wi-Fi you will encounter. You will have a better, more performant experience using your own like 5G smartphone at this point. Well, maybe not if you're on AT&T and Verizon, but if you're on T-Mobile for sure with their 5G network, it's definitely faster than almost any Wi-Fi you're going to find because you're going to be hitting like 300, 400 megabit on that connection compared to what? You're going to get 10, 15 on like decent Wi-Fi. So like, forget it. It's way better anyway. So yeah, don't use it if you don't have to. I think with modern browsing, how everything is SSL, it's probably less of a concern than it used to be, but still inevitably you're going to hit some old site that doesn't do SSL and you're going to transmit something and somebody can sniff it over the connection. It's blah. So, you're just better off anyway. It's going to be faster and better and more secure using your own hotspot anyway. So why not?
Yeah. I like how you said that you still hit the Windows L button because I actually don't. And I should. And I didn't tell you this story before, so you're going to hear this for the first time as well as our listeners. But we did an episode on how I was hacked and how my kids essentially were able to hack me. Mm-hmm. There was another incident prior to that where I left my computer unattended. My office is downstairs, and I typically don't lock my machine because I'm like at home, right? And maybe I should start really doing that. But my youngest kid came to my computer while I was gone, launched the Epic Games launcher, launched my account of Fortnite, which is connected to my credit card, bought himself some V-Bucks using my account, and then sent it to himself. And I was like, wow. I mean, yes, bad on me to have that vulnerability, right? But also, of course, bad on him because he's just basically stealing my money. But anyways, yeah, I mean, it's even at home that can happen, right? Kids are super smart. they're able to, find those vulnerabilities. So yeah, definitely make sure that your machines are locked up. The final two things that the NSA document talked about is don't exchange home and work content. There's, obviously a blending between using different devices. And it's kind of related to the second one here where they talk about using separate devices for different activities, where maybe you consider using one for like your financial stuff and then another one for games or entertainment for children. But of course, definitely if you have a company issued device, try not to do any personal things on it, which I know is difficult. We all do it. But if you have a personal device, try not to do work things on it. So just try to keep those separate and maybe have different devices, even for your personal use, for specific purposes.
So one item in this paragraph that caught my eye was it said, try to connect to a remote desktop or terminal server inside the corporate network rather than make copies of files and transport them between devices. Now, I'm less hung up on the whole idea of use a remote desktop or terminal server. That's one of those like pendulum things that goes back and forth over time where it's like, we're going to do everything as a dumb terminal and just remote in. And there are a lot of flaws with that methodology sometimes because unless you have a very specific use case, users do expect to be able to interact with local devices and stuff. And it's just hard. However, the part that caught my eye there is minimize making copies of files. And it's amazing to me. I'm going to kind of steal this example and use it for something different. It's amazing to me how sometimes companies will choose by design to create copies of stuff and keep it multiple places. So I'm thinking of organizations that, as opposed to standing up some sort of business to business interaction in their SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams environments from a Microsoft perspective, will be like, no, we want that segregated. So we're going to copy all the files that we need to share with business partners and put them in Box. And so now you have two copies of that file. You may have sensitive data in multiple places with different data loss prevention policies and different levels of protection and different levels of auditing and e-discovery. And you've just massively increased your risk by doing that. And so in general, just taking this guidance one step further, keep data where it lives and try to not make copies of it. Don't send attachments through email. Don't do this, don't do that. You decrease your risk dramatically by having just one secured copy and then collaborating on it in place or discovering it in place or sharing it in place. That's something I really strongly believe because I think it's so hard to wrap your arms around where files are going when you let them flow these different directions, especially when they're corporate approved strategy. And I think that's a bad approach. So in general, just not mixing those, business and pleasure is obviously a good idea there as well, just because you start to kind of multiply your risk now that you're in multiple environments at the same time. You've got 1 foot here and 1 foot there. And then even the idea of using separate devices for different activities, again, I think maybe not achievable by a lot of muggles because they don't own multiple devices in a lot of cases. But I like the idea of, we've said on this show, gaming sometimes sits at the intersection of hacker culture. And so not that gaming is inherently risky from a cybersecurity perspective, but I think it does bring additional risk. And so maybe it's not a great idea to run all your bank accounts and your stock brokerage accounts from the same machine you do all your hardcore gaming on, as an example. That's that's kind of what this NSA guidance says. I don't know if a lot of people are going to take them up on it, but it's an interesting point for sure. And one I hadn't really considered.
This whole document, the way that we've talked about it is the same way that we talked about it with that one guy who posted about how, the best practices of cybersecurity and how we're not doing the best practices. And what we had said back then is what I'm going to say now is, the best practices, there's no way that everyone can hit every single thing. Mm-hmm. This best guidance thing here, it's basically everything that you could possibly do right? Like even the smallest thing possible to try to make everything more secure. And there's no way, like not even for me, am I able to hit every single thing on this list. So if you can hit a few, great. You know, you've just increased your cybersecurity a little bit, and maybe that's enough that it'll prevent the next attack. So for me, I definitely took away a few things on this list to go and do. Surprisingly, Adam, I don't have scheduled reboots of my network devices. I'm going to go check that. You know, that's one of the things I'm taking away, because you said that you schedule daily reboots of your network devices, and I'm like, that's such a great idea. I don't do that, and I should. So
mine, I do have to say that was totally performance related. Like security wasn't a thought in my mind, and that comes from that old school mindset of like, oh, did you reboot your router? Like remember the what was it, the WRTDD OS that used to flash on those purple Linksys routers back in the day? Like, you know, that stuff was simultaneously awesome and crappy, because those routers just needed a lot of care and feeding to behave optimally. But still, yeah, exactly. It's one of those simple things of like, for my router, it was literally a checkbox. Like, do you want to reboot? Yes. How often? Daily. What time? 3 a.m. Okay, cool. Like, why not?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I really enjoyed talking through this with you, Adam. This is a great document to look through. If you want the copy, we'll have the link in the show notes. That's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.